All right, so thank you for coming to the first incarnation of Catalyzing Coherence live interviews. We're here with Matthew Schutte of Holochain and my co-producer and co-founder, Brian Hofstein. Thank you. First and foremost, we want to thank Starfish for having us. They've been very generous. Yeah. So they've been nice enough to let us actually develop a podcasting space here. So this is going to be, our new podcasting location, and we're also going to be allowing Starfish companies will be using that space as well. And anyone else who needs to have high quality AV can come use that space. And we'd love to talk to you as well if you're working on interesting projects.
And look at all the AV.
There's so much. In any case, to give you a little bit of a background about what we're doing here in Catalyzing Coherence, I'm going to hand it over to Brian to tell you a little bit of the story of what we're up to.
Yeah, so I'm going to do something that's a little offbeat for the present sort of context or rhythm that we usually have been humming at all week. It's Friday evening, a happy hour. Coherence is what we try to catalyze is a unified worldview that sort of connects all the existing threads that exist in such a way that we see this mosaic whole that sounds, when I say it, almost poetic, and I mean, that's giving myself a little credit, but what they're building is a new infrastructure that holds massive potential for creating a foundation for the new world that a lot of us here think is possible, that we are actually co-building together. And so I'm going to read a little passage from the I Ching, the Book of Changes. It says, this is verse 13, fellowship with men. True fellowship among men must be based upon a concern that is universal. It is not the private interests of the individual that create lasting fellowship among men, but rather the goals of humanity. That is why it is said that fellowship with men in the open succeeds. If unity of this kind prevails, even difficult and dangerous tasks, such as crossing the great water, can be accomplished. And then it goes on to say, though, fellowship should not be a mere mingling of individuals or of things. That would be chaos, not fellowship. If fellowship is to lead to order, there must be organization within diversity. And so the Taoists, there's no end of history, there's no order to the end of things, but there is this harmony of yin and yang, of chaos and order. And I think a lot of us are aware to the remarkable degree of chaos that has saturated the world today. And when we think about new technologies, such as the ones Holochain is working on, we see new potential to tie the story together of this planet. And so we're going to go into, with that we'll do some more introductions to get a better sense of where these guys are coming from on the technical front. But I believe that this is a really special organization, that they've come to our, should we say, market, this time that we find ourselves in at the right time with the right technology. And it's up to us, I guess is what I'd say. This is an easy, free platform for us to all build together and work towards. So it is, the community element is essential. And so let's just keep that in mind as we move forward with tonight's discussion.
Cool. Thanks, Brian. So just, if you can't tell, it's a little bit different than just a tech event here. One of the things that we're really trying to, one of our goals is to incorporate language from the technology, the world of technology, the world of philosophy, and the world, to some extent, of spirituality as well. We view these as different lenses into similar universal patterns that exist throughout the world. And in these different domains of exploration, whether they're scientific or whether they're cultural or whether they are artistic, there's a thread underlying all of these different unique experiences. And we're trying to figure out how to tell the story of that thread in a way that helps us cohere in a world that's accelerating and often pulling us apart. And along those lines, I'd like to introduce Matthew Schutte of Holochain. Matthew is a fascinating individual on so many dimensions. I can't even actually begin to think about them. So, I mean, let me just give you one example. I mean, how many people in this room have ever surfed a 50-foot wave? Yeah, and that's just like one small part of the story. Matthew has also taught me how to surf, and we've had many philosophical discussions on the waves floating out.
Yeah, we this gentleman over here, Dave, in the back, at his birthday party, I met Matt by basically getting in an argument with him. Yeah, I think that was about veganism or something. But yeah,
It's bad category system.
yeah, we've had a lot of fun last couple of years. So I mean, I'll just say for me, I'm excited to have a conversation tonight that's not so much about Holochain. I'm great. I would be happy to make Holochain a little bit visible to you all, but I'm actually much more interested in us exploring and discussing some of the patterns for how natural living systems organize themselves, what the patterns are that work, that we're trying to borrow from in our implementation of technology. And so we'll do a little bit of the tech stuff, but I'm actually much more interested in, hey, let's take a look at nature. And that, I think, is what they're interested in as well. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Very much so. So, I mean, we can just jump right into that if we want to. The theme of this evening was emergence, and we wanted to speak about emergent design. And Holochain is unique in this respect. I've been doing a lot of writing and thinking on the crypto space. My background was in evolutionary psychology and behavioral economics. And so one of my first interactions with studying this field was actually teaching monkeys how to use money. And that was a really interesting experience for many reasons, but you realize quite quickly that human beings are not rational, nor are our ancestors. And that can get in the way of a lot of the types of systems we often attempt to impose from the top down on the complexity of the world. And most design processes have evolved along those lines to create frameworks that are imposed from the top down. And those patterns are actually still alive and with us today, even in the decentralized technology ecosystem. And Holochain is unique in the sense that their team has been thinking about these problems deeply for over a decade, is that right?
Yeah.
Entirely from this emergent perspective of how these living systems, how we can look at economic systems as living organisms, and the immense amount of complexity necessary to weave technology and biological insight together in that domain as a design process. So with that frame, I'd like to turn it over to Matthew to speak a little bit more about that history.
Yeah, so I will. I'll start with sort of just a little history of where does this come from. I'll talk briefly about the current moment, what are the projects that we're putting out into the world right now, and then we'll kind of take this into the more let's explore stuff space. So this comes out of something called the Meta Currency Project, which has been around for about 11 years. There were a handful of folks that met at a community currencies conference in 2004. And these folks met, they got interested in chatting, and they started thinking about designing new forms of currency. Most of them were interested in things like intentional community, managerless organizations, things like that, right? And they started working together. One of them in particular, a guy named Arthur Brock, became a professional currency designer. So he would go in and design the currency systems for a local business community to try to make the local downtown business area more vibrant, or a currency system for the largest whitefish fishery in the United States so that these fishermen didn't accidentally overfish the seas, the waters of their region. All kinds of stuff like that, hundreds of projects, right? And at some point, he went, I was a software developer. I've had software development companies. Why am I having to do these currency design things from scratch every time? We should build some software that makes this easier. And they took a swipe at it about 11 years ago or so, and they created something called Flow Space and Flow Place. And it was interesting. They built interesting currency systems that worked for clients. Some of them are still being used now. But what they found was they would have an organization that was running on one currency system that they had created with this tool, another organization running on a different currency system that they created with this tool, and these two communities couldn't really talk to one another. Those systems didn't interoperate. And they went, oh, shoot, we haven't solved this problem low enough on the stack. We haven't really understood the problem. And it kind of sent them back to the drawing board. And the Meta Currency Project in its current iteration is sort of what emerged out of that. Now, we've been working on what we consider the hard problem in computer science for most of the last decade, and that has to do with interoperability between systems. And we think we've come up with some really interesting solutions there. We finished our proof of concepts around that about 3 years ago, but at that time, one of the close family members of one of our team members she was suffering from cancer, and it became clear that it was going to be terminal. And so we kind of had to put everything on pause for a little bit. Later that year, she had passed away. Our team kind of came back together, and we went, okay, what are we doing next? And the next piece on our roadmap was this distributed data integrity engine thing. It kind of looks like blockchain, but it's not quite blockchain. And we just needed to build that for ourselves. It was the next piece of our roadmap. But we decided, hey, if we build that as a standalone thing, something modular, we can use it, but others could use it as well. Now, all of this stuff is open source software. This has been an all-volunteer project for over a decade, right? We're basically a bunch of hippies who are trying to change the world. Our whole MO is we want to enable new forms of communication in order to make possible new patterns of collaboration and coordination, right? And so we decided at the end of 2016 to launch what we're now calling Holochain. And Holochain is basically a way of building peer-to-peer applications that run on just the devices of the users themselves. So you don't need a web server, you don't need a company, you don't need miners, you don't need cryptocurrency. This is a commons-based architecture where every user of that application shows up as both a user and a host, right? They bear some of the burden of storing some of the content in that community. They bear some of the burden of validating, like their device is sitting there checking, hey, does that play by the rules? Is that message more than 140 characters? Nope, looks good to me. Is it signed by who it's supposed to be signed by? Yep, okay, looks good. Valid, right? That doesn't mean it is valid, they're just stating that from their perspective it's valid, but this is sort of the pattern that we're making use of. We had a slightly different goal with our project than the folks who created blockchain. So Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever she was, right? You don't know. She came out of the cypherpunk movement. That whole community was focused on one problem in particular, which is I want to be able to interact with that guy without that guy coming and whacking me with a stick. That guy usually being played by the government, right? That was what they were fixated on. And they were worried that that guy, the government, would somehow get into the community. And so I can't let him know who I am either, because he might whack me with a stick. And so they got really excited about digital anonymous cash. That's what they wanted to do. If we could only do digital anonymous cash. And Bitcoin is the sort of the consequence of that. But there's an interesting constraint there. If you're having to know nothing about the party that you're interacting with, you don't know how they showed up yesterday, you don't know how they showed up the day before that, you don't know if you just interacted with them 3 seconds ago. Like, this is literally a transaction, an interaction divorced from all history. Well, there's a way that you can solve that. You can have everybody hold on to a copy of everything that everyone has ever done. And that's the blockchain's architecture, right? Does that sound elegant to you? It doesn't sound elegant to me. It's not how natural living systems do this. Your body has trillions of cells in it, right? Do you think that there's one cell in your toe that's holding on to the state of every other cell in your body? That it is inside of itself, maintaining the state of every other thing, and that's actually happening in all of those cells? Is that how our bodies function? No, that's not a scalable architecture. The problems that we're having in the blockchain space around speed and cost and scale and adaptability are a direct consequence of the architecture. Right? The intent has been really interesting. Hey, we want to decentralize power. We're looking to make it so we don't have to rely on centralized corporations in order to communicate with one another. But the intent doesn't get you outcomes. Architecture does. Right? And there's often ways in which we think we're going to get this peer-to-peer thing, and then it turns out, it's kind of a pain in the ass to run a web server. So Tim Berners-Lee, World Wide Web, that was supposed to be peer-to-peer, right? I'll have a web server, you'll have a web server, we'll be able to reference one another's documents. I can go to your web server and click a link and it sends me over to his, and this is amazing, right? And pretty quickly people are like, yeah, I don't want to have a second job running a web server. And they started paying hosting companies. And then eventually they started not even designing their own websites. They started migrating onto platforms where somebody else designed the website and ran the web servers, right? And so that architecture shifted from a distributed one into a centralized one. So without doing too much more there, Holochain is not a platform. Unlike Ethereum and many of the other blockchains, it's not a platform, it's a pattern. Each Holochain app is its own separate space with its own community, right? If I'm running this set of rules, maybe it's Twitter, 140 character tweets, right? So I'm running this app, you're running this app, he's running this app. Great, we're running it together. And sometimes when I tweet, it lands on his device and a bunch of other folks, and sometimes when I tweet, it lands on his device and a bunch of other folks. Cool. We basically combine some of the tech of BitTorrent, blockchain, and Git to create this sort of peer-to-peer app infrastructure. Holochain doesn't have a business model. It's something we're giving away to the world for free. You've seen this play before. How many of you paid your HTML bill recently? Nobody. Why? It's not a platform. It's a pattern. Anybody who wants to put angle bracket B, angle bracket, they can have someone else interpret that as bolded text, right? That's kind of how Holochain works. So I mentioned that the blockchain folks were interested in freedom from constraint by others. We had a slightly different goal. We wanted to enable people to constrain themselves. We wanted to have freedom to constrain ourselves so that we're playing a game together and we don't have to have some third party participating in that game to keep us all honest. We don't need the corporation, we don't need the referee, we don't need the government, we don't need the state inside of this relationship. How many of you have ever played cards at home with friends? Did you have a referee as part of that game? Nope. And when he goes to pick up a card when it's not his turn, what happens? Somebody goes, "Hey, it's Billy's turn, man. What are you doing?" You know? Or if this is a really serious game, you know, he gets shot, right? Back in the 1800s or something, right?
We are on the frontier.
Yeah, that's right. We're familiar with this pattern. This pattern of, hey, there's a bunch of us playing something together. We've got some agreed upon set of rules. When anybody starts misbehaving, even just one party noticing that can call it out. When you go, hey, don't do that, you're both signaling to them that that's not okay, and you're also signaling to everybody else at the table that that's not okay. This is how our bodies deal with threats, too. The immune response looks something like this. There's some kind of problem, an infection, whatever, right? There's some issue, and a cell sees that issue, and it moves into action. It moves to try to attack that problem, and it signals to others. Hey, there's a problem over here. When the other cell receives the signal, it goes, ooh, and it goes to check it out. And if it finds a problem, ooh, it moves into action too. It's not a global consensus model. It's each participant, each party, each agent seeing, ooh, nope, this doesn't feel right, moving to take action and calling out to others. That's basically the model that we're making use of in Holochain as well. The one last thing that I'll make visible is Holo Host. So this is the first big app that we're building on Holochain. This is basically being built both to help subsidize Holochain. It has a business model. 50% of its revenues will go into Holochain. And it's an app designed to service other Holochain apps. So Holo Host basically enables people who've built some peer-to-peer Airbnb, let's say. Right? We've got our own little peer-to-peer app. We love it. But we don't want only geeky early tech adopters to be able to book rooms. We want anybody to be able to book a room. So Holo Host enables the members of our community to serve out websites to visitors, to people who aren't showing up as full peers. And when they serve out those websites, they get compensated for doing so by the community or by the developer. Today, that developer pays Amazon Web Services to host websites. In Holo Host, that developer pays the members of their own community to host websites to visitors. But what that does for us is it makes it a frictionless migration, because Matt's grandpa opens a computer, types in a URL, and goes to a website. From his perspective, there's nothing new happening here. This is how he's been using the internet for 2 decades now, right? Okay, maybe a decade. He might have been a little slow to get onto the whole web thing. But on the back end, there's a community operating that, not a company. So that's Holo Host. I'll do the little pitch there so that people know why that actually matters. How many of you have heard of Amazon? Right. The third most valuable company on the planet. Their CEO is the wealthiest man on the planet, aside from Vladimir Putin. Vlad's not owning up to all the stuff that he owns, but
Trying to get us poisoned in the first episode here.
yeah, that's right. That's right. Somebody starts rubbing things on your face. So, Amazon, third most valuable company on the planet. Their web hosting or app hosting division, Amazon Web Services, makes up about 10% of their revenues, but accounts for more profit than the entire rest of the company combined. That's true, yeah. So web hosting is the cash cow of the third most valuable company on the planet. And you can think of what we're trying to do with Holo Host as, due to Amazon's cash cow, what Uber did to taxis. Right? We're trying to take the idle assets, the spare storage and computing power on everyone's laptops and desktops, and make it so that they can do that hosting work with just the extra capacity that their machines have, and get paid for the contribution. All right, so that should give us a little overview of kind of what is the tech stuff. Now let's dive into why that's interesting and how it, yeah, I'll let you guys sort of lead with the questions department stuff, and we'll dive into living systems, et cetera.
Yeah, so I think one thing there's a lot to pick apart there, and you kind of outlined this very grand vision. One thing that's quite interesting to me in terms of emergent systems is thinking about boundaries. So you talk about the cells. You talk about if we talk about structures, we're in a bounded structure at the moment. We're in a room. We have an enclosure. It sets a certain amount of constraints or parameters. It creates rules in which we can play the games. Some of them are explicit and some of them are implicit. But if you look at it and you kind of have this what's known as a holarchy, which is you could imagine a circle inside a circle inside a circle inside a circle, a very deeply nested structure. Nature is very much like that, and boundaries are very much like that. We have our cellular boundaries, our membranes, and then we have our skin that keeps all of the water in, hopefully, at least most of the time. And then we have the structures in which we inhabit, and then we have certain types of management of the boundaries of cities and borders, and then we have nation states outside of that. And all of these have different scales of rules, and some of them are emergent and we don't think about and kind of bubble up from the top down. And for some of them, we have very complex structures, largely bureaucratic, largely centralized, to manage explicitly what happens at those boundaries. So I imagine in a system like you're conceptualizing and building, boundaries are quite critical, and managing the idea of those boundaries and how information flows across them at each of those scales is probably quite important. So perhaps that's
Cool.
something to speak about.
Yeah. So I'll start by thinking about a group as and drawing an analogy between a social group and a biological cell, right? So in a biological cell, you have a membrane, as Matt was mentioning. That membrane is it's not just a boundary. It doesn't keep everything out, right? It's kind of like a judgment layer. It lets some things in, it lets some things out, it keeps other things out, it keeps certain things in, right? And so, and sometimes that cell is breached, like its will is overcome with scissors or something, or a needle, right? So, or a virus, yeah. let's think about a social group. Now, often when we think about social groups like a company, we think about them through this, are you an employee, are you not an employee, where are the legal boundaries of the organization, all this kind of stuff, right? And it can feel like, yes, we have 35 employees, right? That's how big our organization is, and we have these 3 buildings and these machines, and that's who we are. That's the stuff that's inside the membrane. And that's not actually how it works. It's also not how the cell works. Like, the cell is basically a bunch of little parts that are working together to generate and maintain that boundary. If they stop doing that work, it erodes pretty quickly. It decays and goes away. Same with a group. We can think of the group as if we can see it from the top, but that's not actually how it functions. The way it functions is each of the individuals inside of that group has their own expectations about what's appropriate or inappropriate, right? So let's say we have a rule that says the restroom is for employees only. And then a pretty girl comes in and says, can I use the restroom? And the kid behind the counter goes, yeah, sure. Keys, right? It's no longer for employees only. Why? Because one of the members of the group didn't treat that membrane, he didn't reinforce that.
They allowed their own personal incentives or their own personal priorities to overcome or to allow for a breach in the membrane.
And we see this all the time. It's not just, there's this weird way in which we could think of what that kid did as bad. It's not necessarily bad, right? But it wasn't in alignment with how that organization, what the edict from above had been. We have this fantasy of the CEO says we're going in that direction, and everybody magically goes, yes, we're going in that direction. Bullshit. Anyone who's ever worked in an organization knows it doesn't work like that, right? The CEO goes, we're going to go, I'm new here, and you guys have been screwing up all this time, and we're going over there, and everybody goes, like, we're going to make sure that guy doesn't get where he won't last, right? That is not how organizations work. It's a fantasy. It's not how we actually function. It's always this bottom-up thing where each of us is deciding, yes, this is what I want to do today. Yes, this is what I think is appropriate or inappropriate. We didn't try to reinforce the fantasy. We went, oh, that's how communities actually steer themselves. Let's build tools that can support that. So when you run a Holochain app, it's not a place that you go to. It's a grammar that you speak with a specific community, right? Today, when you use an app, you go to that app, and then you come back out. You go to Facebook and come back out. You go to Uber and come back out, etc. How many of you feel pulled in 40 different directions every day? What's doing most of the pulling? Your phone, right? Why? Because every one of those apps is a place that wants to pull you in and addict you and distract you, because the maker of that app has an incentive to get you to spend as much time as possible in their space so that they can monetize your eyeballs. Basically, right? That's the business model. That's the architecture. The consequence is all of us feel pulled in 1,000 different ways. By flipping this around a little bit and treating applications not as places that you go to, but as grammars that you speak. And by grammars, what I mean here is information is always in a particular form. Right? It's in formation. So right now we have several forms of information. We've got light information, we've got sound information, we've got English, which is writing on top of sound in this instance. I'm going to have all of you close your eyes for just a moment. Please close your eyes. Please close your eyes. Matt, I'm going to have you open your eyes. Everybody else, keep your eyes closed. Matt, how many fingers did I have up? Please announce it to everybody.
2.
Great. Everybody, did you hear that? You can open your eyes. How many fingers did I have up? How did you know? Did you see it? No?
I'm very trustworthy.
That's right. he transformed information that was in the form of light that he had access to into information that was in the form of sound that you had access to. Now, you had to trust him, and if he shows up over and over again as somebody who's not trustworthy, pretty soon you might be like, I have no idea how many fingers he threw up because that guy's a jerk, you know?
I'm not, though.
He's not. Maybe a little.
Maybe.
Maybe a little. It turns out that this capacity to transform information that is in one form, in one grammar, into information that's in a different form is a key to ecosystems. The difference between a network and an ecosystem is this. In a network, whether it's a centralized network, a decentralized network, a distributed network, in a network you have agents passing information of a particular form. He tells me, I tell him, he tells him, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're speaking the same shared protocol or the same grammar. In an ecosystem, I'm able to receive information in one form and then transform it and send it in a different form. The agent serves as the bridge between two different communities, right? So if I'm speaking a grammar over here and I'm speaking a different grammar over here, cool, I can bridge between those spaces, but I can also pull information in from both of them and combine it together. So Holochain apps enable us to create what are basically called meta applications, where you might be speaking to several different applications on the back end, but to you it all looks like one thing. Maybe nobody else in the world is treating it as that specific configuration of applications, but it doesn't matter, it's useful for you. There's a couple of examples here. One, I hit a button and it orders rides from 5 different ride-sharing organizations. Right? It asks for offers. And they show up, you know, Bill will be here in 2 minutes, it's $4. Jimmy will be here in 3 minutes, it's $2, et cetera, et cetera. And I go, that one. And it cancels the other 4, and my ride's booked, right? That's cool. Probably more interesting is something like an Airbnb, where we've got an Airbnb kind of app where the only rating that we have community-wide is, was it good or bad? Thumbs up or thumbs down? In addition to that, we might have separate applications for every other kind of rating that we would want. How noisy was it? How was the location? Is he a good cook? Et cetera, et cetera. Instead of us as a community having to all agree, yes, this is the set of things that we are all going to rate people on, we can have the things that we care about show up, right? So that when we're rating people, it's the attributes that we care to pay attention to that show up. And when we look things up, we're able to do the same. And the way that works on the back end is when somebody says, hey, you could stay at my place, as soon as that hits your device then reads it out into those other apps and pulls back all the ratings for noisiness and location and how does he cook, et cetera. And from your perspective, it all just looks like it's one app, right? But this enables disjointed innovation. It doesn't require us to all take a vote and move in lockstep with one another, right? All right, I'll stop there for a moment. A couple of things just to highlight, like not to talk about now, but just to say, hey, these would be interesting to cover. Mm-hmm. One is how living systems function. Another is flows. Sure. And then out of that, maybe coherence, since that is sort of the title of this.
Okay. Well, I think we can lead us there. Perhaps we start with flows through these systems, because I think that might be a good springboard for us to kind of start unpacking a few of the concepts that we've been talking about with respect to coherence. So in terms of flows, in terms of nature or natural flows, flow systems are one of these types of systems that conform to scale invariant mathematics. So you can see the same patterns emerge in terms of flow optimization, whether it's water running down mountains and creating erosion, or whether it's the blood vessels in your body trying to take oxygen and nutrients to a very large, very granular surface, being your entire cells in your body. And so we're just starting to speak about this and actually research this. There's a mathematician, Adrian Behan, who he created something called the constructal law. And we don't have to go too deeply into that. It's just this idea that some simple patterns and some simple structural regularities occur within any system across which there is a flow. And that flow can be in the form of physical matter or information. But the interesting connection between that is, and you could even look at physical matter as information, and that might be the fundamental way to look at it, and that might be the fundamental connection. But there are these deep unifying structures that, regardless of the type of systems we create, we then have to navigate those realities. And we might think that we can snap our fingers with a governmental system or a CEO changing direction and saying, oh, you know what, this particular policy, wealth inequality is an interesting example of this. All the information that we have points to Pareto distributions, which are these functions of power law systems that are quite closely tied with things like fractal flows. And so, I don't want to go too deep into these weeds, perhaps I already have. Yeah, I have that tendency, I'm sorry.
I'm going to bring it back to flows.
But we're gonna bring it back to flows, because I'm just kind of curious in terms of like, how do you strike that balance between these deeply natural patterns that emerge no matter who's trying to hold the reins, and communities that still need to act their intentions out in the world?
Yeah. So at some level, you were getting at emergence versus intent there. So one thing I'll start with is a living system is a system of flows, right? Your body has flows moving through it right now. So does mine. We're breathing, right? We've got blood flows, all sorts of things going on. If we stop those flows for any considerable period of time, we break the coherence of that living system. The technical term for this is it dies, right? If you cut me off from oxygen for just 15 short minutes, I'm no longer a Matthew, I'm a corpse, right? This material would be useful for something else to eat, but it's no longer doing the function of turning oxygen into carbon dioxide and, et cetera, cracking poor jokes up on stage. So living systems are systems of flow. That's sort of the first thing to note. Second, there's a guy named Paul Kraffel who wrote a book called Seeing Nature. Super interesting, naturalist, lives in Northern California. And in that book, he maps out just some basic principles of flow. And it kind of looks like this. The first thing he points out is there's sort of two layers to flows. One is sort of the individual layer, and then the other is sort of the aggregate layer. But because it actually happens across many scales, you can just think of it as the lower and the upper. What's the difference between a car backing up and traffic backing up? Well, with a car backing up, the car is actually moving backwards, right? What happens when traffic backs up? The cars are moving forward, but they're slowing down, and the place at which they're slowing down is moving backwards, right? So that's kind of this higher layer as opposed to the lower layer.
And if you zoom out there, you also see it as a wave rippling backwards in time.
That's right. So one of the things that he points out is if you have inflow greater than outflow, you get accumulation. Sort of like those cars backing up, right? If you have outflow greater than inflow, you get a decrease in the amount of content at that higher layer. So, for instance, if you ate fewer calories and you did lots of exercise, you burn lots of calories and you're not eating very many, what's going to happen to you? You are going to shrink in size, right? What happens if your inflow matches outflow? You stay the same. And this is interesting because there are many things in our world that look like nothing is going on because there's a balance in the flows. when actually there may be a really complex system happening there that just happens to be balanced. And if you tip that balance a little bit one way or the other, it can throw everything really far out of whack. You can lose a whole ecosystem simply by, whoop, we accidentally tipped this thing and all of a sudden the water drained away, and because we didn't have enough water, all the trees died, and because the trees died, then the soil couldn't be held in place, and so that started eroding away, and it's just a downward spiral, right? So a couple of things here about coherence and flows. Anytime you have an interaction between two parties, you've got a communication. Anytime you have a communication, you can think of that as the formation of a community, a we. We're now dancing together in some way. He does something and it influences me. If nothing else, it changes how I'm thinking about the world or whatever, right? So we are now sort of operating as if we're a unit. And the more we interact, the greater our capacity for working in alignment with one another will become. Right? You've all seen this. If you've worked with a team for 5 years, you don't even think about it. Like, this person just barely starts to move, and you know exactly what to do next to get out of their way so they can go make that next coffee or whatever if you're working as a barista, right? Recently, I've been thinking a fair bit about the way in which coherence naturally emerges through interaction. That it's at the points where you have things bumping up against one another, where you experience friction, that you end up experiencing growth, and you end up having those things become somewhat knit together in some way. Now, it could be that the way in which you get into alignment is that this thing goes away entirely, right? Often that will happen. Two species come to interact, and then one of them just gobbles the other. But this interaction leads to resonance thing feels like it's a pattern not just in social systems. It feels like it's a pattern in physics. I got to have an interesting conversation recently with a guy who's like one of the best cellists in the world, and we were talking about the making of modern cellos. They think they've cracked the code on how to make modern cellos and violins like the masters from 300 years ago. Yeah, like the Stradivarius. Yeah. And he owns a $10 million Stradivarius, right? And he's like, yeah, but it doesn't sound as good as my 10-year-old cello. But that has to do with resin and all that kind of stuff. At the same time, we talked about what him playing the playing the cello has done to that cello. They had gone to Carnegie Hall, used a specific set of microphones, recorded the cello. 10 years later, after him playing it professionally for 10 years, they went back and recorded with the same microphones, and it sounds better. And my hunch is, yes, at some microscopic levels, that cello has transformed as a consequence of the signal that was being put through it. The way I frame this generally is signal shapes architecture, and then architecture shapes signal. But I'll leave it there for a second. Go ahead.
Just wanted to follow up briefly. I know Brian wanted to ask a question, but are you familiar with the concept of annealing or simulated annealing?
Yeah.
So perhaps that. So
can you make that visible?
Yeah, we can make that visible. So there's this process called annealing. It's a metallurgical term where you would heat up a piece of metal, and the atoms in that metal, which are somewhat in disarray, move more. There's more energy in the system, so they have more freedom. But then as it cools back down, they actually reintegrate a little bit more closely with each other. And when you actually repeat that process again and again and again, it actually becomes more coherent with itself. And that gives the metal properties that you would want, that are desirable when you're actually working with metal. It becomes both strong and flexible simultaneously, and actually increases the overall, you could call it positive sum or positive qualities of that metal that you're working with. And in a way, when you speak about this cello experience, it reminds me of that, because when you're playing it, you're introducing energy into the system. And not just any energy. It's not random energy. It's patterned energy. It's actually musical notes, highly patterned, highly structured energy and waveforms. And then it basically resettles again. And then it goes into, you put it away and it kind of cools off. And then you do it. So it really does seem like that might be similar.
And it wasn't just random. Like, discordant things, right? This guy's a really good cellist, so he's hitting spot on notes all the time. And one of the things that we were talking about, so because he got really excited about this whole signal shapes architecture and architecture shapes signal conversation. For me, that's just fundamental, right? Like when you're a kid and you're first learning how to walk, you don't know how to walk, and so you're trying stuff. And every one of those attempts has your muscles both trying things out. There are little neurons firing in your brain, right? And eventually you find something that seems like it's working. And you're like, oh, and you get high as a kite, let's just be really clear. And you do that over and over and over again. And when you're doing that over and over and over again, you're running additional signal through that same pathway. And because you're running signal through that same pathway, you're strengthening that pathway. Because you're actually using your legs to do that, they are building up musculature, right? And so the signal shapes the architecture. But at this point, you don't even think about it when you walk upstairs, right? Because the architecture is so dominant that you just have to start that thing, and it's a chain reaction that results. The architecture shapes the signal. With his cellos, we were talking about, the body of the cello and the finish and all this stuff makes it so that when you play that note, it resonates, right? And if you had a really strong signal, whether it was a hammer blow or just a really loud sound wave, it may delaminate the cello. It could actually fracture that object, in which case when you try to play that string again, it's not going to resonate in the same way, right? It's going to have a different sound. So this interplay between these two has been really interesting for us. And I know this has all been super abstract, right? So I'll try to pull this a little bit back into the Holochain stuff, like why would this matter? We don't think that we're smart enough to figure out how everybody on the planet should steer themselves. We think that individuals faced with their own context will be in the best position to go, that sucked. Maybe I should try something different. And they don't need something that's perfect. They just need good enough. But through that process of being able to go, I don't like how this works. I want to try something different. Let me try that. Each of us being able to try different things, we will be able to find things that work well for us. And if we're each finding things that work well for us at a much larger level, our community starts to function more coherently as a result. This is how humans do social interaction bottom up, right? Like, you don't normally have a CEO inside of your marriage. I mean, I hope not. Some marriages do, and I don't want to be in that one. I mean, Matt's marriage is definitely going to have a CEO. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It's at larger scales that humans have had a hard time with this stuff, right? We've had a hard time being able to coordinate in these sort of bottom-up ways at big scale, and it has to do with the fact that there's just too much information, that we don't know. If it's a 7 billion person planet and I go to interact with you, I don't know what you did yesterday. I don't know if I can rely upon you for this stuff. Like the reputation system stuff, it's just not functional at that scale. But when you have tools that enable you to go, let me show you some of my past. Let me show you some of the things that are relevant to this moment. You want me to fix your car? It turns out I'm a certified mechanic, right? Let me bring that credential into the current moment. Let me bring the Yelp reviews into the current moment, right? Those kinds of things are sort of the today's version of how we are augmenting our sense-making capacities with technology. This stuff enables us to do that at vastly different scales because of the transformation aspect, because I can go, I trust him to go and filter that stuff down and hand it to me in a particular form, and I'm going to combine that with some other things that I got from over here.
So nature's been designing systems for billions of years, so it makes sense that it would have figured out a pretty efficient way for flows to happen naturally. You guys have some ridiculous efficiency rates compared to what exists. Did you touch on some of the numbers?
No, I did not, but that was a funny, just where you took that was like, oh, okay, interesting. So I want to actually comment on that, because you said nature has been working on stuff for billions of years. It's figured out things that are really efficient. And one of the things that I pay attention to most is that we fetishize efficiency in our culture. Nature...
Harmonious, maybe, the more appropriate word?
I think that's basically, I think you're in the same ballpark, efficiency and harmony. The point that I'm trying to make is there's a whole other half to the story. So nature has two things that are always in tension: efficiency and resilience. Efficiency is always efficiency in a particular context, right? And the way that you get to efficiency is by having, I'm trying a bunch of different things. These ones don't seem like they're working so well. This one seems like it's working pretty good. Hey, let's stop doing these things that don't work so well, right? Well, the way we get to efficiency is actually by reducing diversity, by eliminating the stuff that isn't working and pushing more effort through the thing that is working. But when our context changes, when the world around us shifts, if we are really well geared for our current context, we might go extinct when that shift occurs. So nature has processes for making sure that there is diversity at all times. Basically, nature tries to carry as much diversity as possible through, because it's the key to making sure that you have something on the table that doesn't go extinct when the next change happens, regardless of what that change might be.
Yeah, biodiversity in all forms is so key to all ecologies. You've also touched on this term that I like a lot, is Nassim Taleb's notion of anti-fragility, that systems that can actually improve when change is increased. And it sounds like some of the design elements are in favor of anti-fragile systems.
I mean, the whole point is, hey, I'm going to try something, I'm going to try something else. I experienced some kind of failure. Ooh, that didn't work so well for me. Not only can I try the new thing, but I might let lots of other people know, hey, watch out for this, right? This thing will screw you over. And that enables learning at sort of a higher layer of coherence, right? My favorite example of this sort of, we learn from the mistakes of individuals. We learn at a group level. My favorite example is from The Simpsons. Right? So how many of you have seen The Simpsons? Again, you might notice I keep asking questions where everybody raises their hands. There's an episode in The Simpsons that's like a Lord of the Flies episode, right? And Ralph is the police officer's son, I think, Wiggums. He goes and eats some purple berries, right? And he's got like this purple berry smear around his face, and the kids walk up and they go, "How do they taste, Ralph? Do they taste good?" And Ralph drops onto the floor and goes, "Taste like burning, oh." Okay?
Smart.
And the other kids are not going to eat those purple berries, right? The entire community learned the lesson because of one bold explorer, young Ralph Wiggums, right? Going off and pioneering some new path, okay? This is how innovation works, folks. Ralph Wiggums is the key to innovation. No. The term that we use, the technical term for this, is holographic storage. In other words, in order to learn that lesson, we didn't have to have every kid on the island eat the purple berries. We didn't use a global consensus model. We didn't have everyone doing the same thing. One party went off and took the risk. And if they learn something useful, whether it's something to do or not to do, that information can be propagated to others. And if those others, when they receive that information, go, "Ooh, this is useful," they may continue using it, and they might propagate it to others. The technical term for this is holographic storage. It comes from the fact that a hologram works a little differently than how a photograph works. So if I took a photograph of this room, looking from my perspective right now, and I cut it in half, and I got rid of this half of the photograph, I'd be stuck with only these folks, right? This part of the information, gone. That's how photographs work. But a hologram is a little different. With a hologram, if I take this image and I cut it in half, and I just have this half now, I can tilt it and still see what was over there. But I'm seeing what was over on that side of the room from the perspective of this half of that piece of film. If I cut it again and again and again and end up with just a little corner, I can still see the whole. but only from the perspective of that little corner. So the idea of holographic storage is that each part sees the whole, but from its own perspective, right? We all speak English in this room. Do we have identical copies of English? No, right? Each of us has some slightly different backgrounds. I'm a surfer, so I've got funny words like choppy and ledgy and it was so sick, bro, in my vocabulary. Dave has that too, by the way. We could say, hey, this was the AV conversation. You guys remember when they had all that AV equipment out? Right? We could name this conversation the AV conversation. For everybody in this room, later on, if I'm like, what did you think of the AV conversation? You might go, yeah, it was all right.
I think you've just named the conversation.
I did. Now, if we walk out on the street and go, what did you think of the AV conversation? What are they going to say? What? Right? Because they weren't in this room. They don't have that reference. It wasn't something that they were able to perceive, so it's not part of their worldview. We think that holographic storage is the key to adaptive capacity because it enables a community to get the most amount of learning for the least amount of risk. Right? The individual takes the risks, the learnings can propagate. It's how we do language, it's how we do culture. It's not yet how we do digital communication. It's not how we do collaboration at scale. The whole point with Holochain is to change that, to make that how we do collaboration at scale. That's where the name Holo comes from, is holographic storage. Yeah?
How can we talk about natural systems in a digital world when you have to go through a centralized ISP in order to get there?
Great. So I'll point out there's sort of two layers here. The layer that we are attacking at present is peer-to-peer applications. So that's an applications layer. As you just pointed out, there's this whole other thing of routing. How can we communicate when we're still having to go through AT&T or Comcast, right? Yep, that's an issue too. People have been working on mesh networks for a long time. They haven't hit the mainstream in any significant way yet. I'm hopeful that some of the currency designs that we're demonstrating with Holo Host will get repurposed. I mean, we've been speaking explicitly with some folks in the mesh networking worlds. My vision for how peer-to-peer routing works in the future is that individuals are willing to pass along data on behalf of others, but they're willing to do so if any of these X number of criteria are met. Oh, you're a member of my family? You ride for free. Oh, you're an upstanding member of some community I'm a part of? You get a discount. You're a stranger? You pay full price, right? And you pay now. And so I think that that's how we'll see these peer-to-peer systems start to emerge. The problem in the past with the mesh networking stuff has been there's no way. If I put up a tower, yay, I just spent a bunch of dough to put up a tower, and there's no way for me to benefit from that. The only way in the existing internet architecture for an individual to monetize the passing of information is by owning the customer relationship, by owning that last mile, right? If we instead create some protocols that enable you could do the traditional stuff where you're going through TCP, where you're going through an IP, ISP, internet service provider, where you're going through an ISP and then on the back end they're dealing with the accounting. You could still do that, but if you also have protocols available that enable others in your neighborhood to go, yeah, you can have your message hop onto my phone and I'll get on a subway, and when I get downtown, it'll hop onto somebody else's phone and it'll get delivered for you. Like, you can have sneaker net stuff. You can have these, it hops, and it's paying on the way. There's some different architectures that can start to emerge. The other folks are working on some of those types of peer-to-peer routing architectures being anonymous as well, which is really interesting. Like, how many of you have heard of Orchid as a project? So Orchid, how many of you have heard of Tor? Cool. So Orchid's kind of like Tor. Okay, so there's this anonymous routing stuff going on. And those folks get excited. When I've talked to some of those people, they get really excited about Holochain, because Holochain enables us in a community to build up some social coherence. We didn't talk too much about all this stuff. If you go on Facebook, I did a live stream of a talk last night where I dive into a whole different area, all the game theory stuff around how these systems function, how the Holochain ecosystem operates, et cetera. So you can go and look that up there. But with this ISP, kind of how can we do peer-to-peer routing thing, that's where I see it going. I see some new protocols emerging where if I put up a tower or lay some fiber, I can actually benefit from having done that, which means there can be a reinforcement of that pattern, and that kind of pattern can become much more common. Right now it's, hey, if you want to pay for everybody else to have access, that would be great. That's not a pattern that can feed itself, unfortunately.
So I want to be considerate of our hosts. Matt, how are we doing on time? Are we good to keep going, or? Okay.
How are we doing on energy? I mean, I feel like
how's
we've been
everybody
talking for a
feeling?
little while.
Everybody's ready for a Friday night, I think.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll do. Does anyone else have any questions for Matthew before we wrap this up? And any final questions? Any final thoughts?
Yeah.
I think we have one back there.
If in, say, some years, Holochain was successful in the sense that it got big, but it went like vastly off the rails and they didn't feel as good, what would you expect for it to have gone wrong?
Good question.
I don't know. So just in case anybody couldn't hear, if Holochain becomes really big but goes off the rails in some way, how would it have gone off the rails?
Are we kind of hinting at the, if you become Facebook, what are the externalities that you didn't plan for?
I don't think we can become Facebook. Not that there couldn't be a Facebook. I mean, I think some of the tendencies for humans to steer towards the easy solution, somebody else is handling something for me, I think that's pretty strong. I'm hoping that these patterns, like we've tried to build something that's really easy, so that the burden of showing up as a full participant is vastly outweighed by the benefits. But I don't know what the future looks like entirely. One of the things that's not going to be super visible initially, but will become visible within 18 months or so, is when you start bridging between lots of different applications, and those applications don't quite speak about the world in the same ways. They're using slightly different grammars. So this one's using city-state zip, and this one's using latitude-longitude. You end up needing to bridge between those. And I think as people start to put together lots of these kind of meta applications, they'll begin to experience pain there. We have previously built some stuff that helps solve that problem, but it's going to be probably a couple of years before we get that stuff out. I have a hard time seeing Holochain leading to a top-down system, just because of how we've architected it. Also because of how we financed it. We gave away no equity to any investors. We gave away no equity to any employees. We're planning to hand over Holo host. This is the for-profit business. That itself is getting handed over to the community. So initially, the community will control 1% to 3% of the revenues, and over time, that will grow to them controlling all of the revenue. Initially, they're not going to know what to do with that, but because they'll have a pile of money to figure out how to spend, they'll figure out how to do stuff with that, right? Like, do we want to do educational materials or new language development, or et cetera? One area that might be, here's what I think is going to happen. People are going to try to use this for everything. And it's not good for everything, right? It'll be useful for a bunch of stuff. Also, people are going to take some pattern that somebody has created over here that works great in their context, in their community, and they're just going to hit copy, paste, and it's going to be catastrophic because they're going to be dropping it into a different context that looks nothing like that. And so I think there's going to be this Cambrian explosion of social organisms where we're trying different patterns and ways of running organizations and communities, and there's going to be a bunch of pain in the learning process. Really, like people are going to try stuff and it's going to fail. That's how life works. And they're going to find things. They're going to try things and those will work. And we'll. That's how these things will emerge. That brought me back to your intent versus emergence thing. I'll leave the intent versus emergence thing is, I'll frame it this way. Don't make your intentions too clear too far into the future, right? Like, don't think that, oh, we're going to bring the world from here to right there. Bullshit. Because on the way, you're going to be changing the world, and you're not going to end up where you're wanting to go. So I'd say, kind of have a loose vision of where you're wanting to go, and then start taking the steps. And if you move, pretty soon allies will emerge, and they'll help you to grow all of that. That's actually a pattern that Paul Kraffel talks about in Seeing Nature, the way in which as soon as you start to take action, allies emerge. You see this in natural systems all over the place.
And I think on that note, that's probably a good place for us to wrap up. Thank you again so much to Starfish Mission for having us. It's been absolutely wonderful to be here.
And I'll hang out for a few minutes if anybody has questions.
And I think I would love to obviously extend the conversation perhaps on the podcast. We're launching our podcast, Catalyzing Coherence. If you guys like this conversation and want to see more, we also have a Patreon account, patreon.com/catcoherence. And I would love to have you on to dig deeper into these topics and perhaps extend this conversation there.
Cat coherence?
We love it. we love dogs too, but
No, you don't.
Again, we've named it. It's the AV conversation. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for coming here. Have a good night.